morning, church. Let's turn our Bibles to Genesis chapter 12. We're going to pick up in verse 10 this morning. Genesis chapter 12, starting in verse 10. Well, memories are fascinating, aren't they? Isn't it amazing how you can just be going about your business and a random event from decades ago that you haven't thought about in years suddenly pops into your brain? How a certain smell or a certain sound or a certain emotion can trigger a groundswell of recollections, and suddenly you're back in that childhood home, or running through that field, or sitting in that restaurant, or on that first date, or holding your child for the first time, or gathering around that hospital bed to say goodbye to someone you love. Sometimes we remember these things in great detail. We remember the temperature that day. We remember what people were wearing, what color the wallpaper was. Everything feels as real as the moment it happened. But some memories are more like faded impressions. You remember small aspects of it, maybe even the way it made you feel, but the details are hazy. Well, I have one memory like that from when I was a small child. I know I was in somebody's arms, I don't know who. We were outside, though I don't know where, but there was some kind of celebration or festival going on because I remember there were balloons. And not just balloons that you blow up yourself. I mean, these balloons had some kind of magic air in them because they could float. And you had to hold them down with a string, and someone had put one string into my hand and told me, hold on to that really tight, don't let go. But y'all, I was so excited to have this levitating object in my hand, to pull it, to punch it, to watch it dance above my head. And I just remember feeling really, really happy in that moment, until the string started to slip between my fingers. And I tried to clasp my hand shut with all my might, only to find I was holding empty air as I observed that dangling string ascend just beyond my reach. And then came the sinking dread as I watched helplessly as my balloon rose into the heavens, growing smaller and smaller until I couldn't see it anymore. And all I remember in that moment was feeling really, really sad. I probably cried my eyes out. And I'm sure there were lots of adults around me that day who were quick to console me. I'm sure somebody went and got me another balloon. Maybe this time they even tied it around my wrist for better safekeeping. But no matter what anybody did at that point, they couldn't bring my balloon back. Not that balloon. It was gone forever. Something good was literally in my hands, and because of my carelessness, I would never see it again. I imagine that's how Abram felt in our passage this morning. He had just come off a major spiritual high. I mean, the God of the universe literally came to him and radically changed his life, calling him out of darkness of worshiping false gods and practicing immorality, inviting him back into a relationship with him. And man, Abram just has to be on fire at this point, right? I mean, when God tells him to go, he immediately goes. And now Abram is in the land that God promised him with his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and Abram can't stop getting his praise on, y'all. I mean, everywhere he goes throughout Canaan, he's worshiping. And how could he not? Ever since he began following the Lord, man, God was just blessing him left and right. I mean, life is good. This is what he was made for. Maybe you remember days like that when you first started following the Lord. Maybe you look back and think, it was easy to follow God then. It was easy to believe then. It was easy to walk by faith then because all the blessings were right before your eyes. But then the days got hard, and the fire started to dim, and now it all just starts to feel so far away. Well, that's kind of what it was like for Abram too. Holding fast to the promise was easy when it felt like he was constantly making progress. But then the trials came. Then the setbacks came. And what once seemed like a sure thing began to feel like it was slipping through his fingers and floating away. See, in our passage this morning, Abram's going to face his first major test of faith. And spoiler alert, he's going to fail miserably. We see, first of all, Abraham's faith is tested by his circumstances. It's tested by his circumstances. Look at verse 10. It says, now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. Now, it's not surprising that there's a famine. Famines were very common in the ancient world. But what is shocking here is where the famine is taking place. Because where's Abram? He's in Canaan. Isn't that the promised land? Shouldn't this be a place of flourishing and prosperity? The Israelites who were first hearing the story were probably wondering the same thing. I thought this was going to be a place filled with milk and honey. And Moses says it will be, but not because of anything that's special about the land itself, but because of the God who will be with them in the land. Just like Adam and Eve in the garden before them, if they will walk with God, they will experience flourishing, peace, shalom in the land. But if they depart from him, they will once again experience death and disease and chaos. Moses is telling them this will become a prosperous land, but only if Yahweh is honored as king of the land. And that hasn't happened yet. This land still belongs to the wicked Canaanites, so it's not flourishing. It's ripe for famine. But nevertheless, while the passage does not say that Abram's faith wavered at this point, it had to be very confusing to him. Why did God bring him all the way out here only to starve? If Abram is going to be a great nation, brother's going to have to eat, right? So he and his family get up and they go. Where? Egypt. What? That's almost as shocking as the famine in the promised land. Abram is seeking refuge in the very place that God's people would one day seek deliverance from. Like, what in the world? But while this might seem strange, Egypt would have been a common destination for people back then, because unlike Canaan, which was completely dependent on rainfall for sustenance, Egypt had the Nile River, which provided a constant source of nourishment no matter how dry the season was. So this won't be the last time we'll see people journeying to Egypt in Genesis. In fact, the book ends with Jacob's, aka Israel's, family moving there during another famine and prospering there. So the mentioning of Abram going to Egypt here is not suggesting that Abram has done anything wrong. In fact, there's no commentary in this text whether this was a good decision or a bad decision. It just seems to be a neutral one. Abram and his family needed food, so they went where the food was. But regardless, this seems to be the undoing of everything Abram was promised. This doesn't look like blessing. He's back in a country that's far from the land that was promised to him. And if he and his family don't get some food, he's hardly going to be a great nation. You can't produce descendants if you're dead. And moreover, where's God in all of this? He's not mentioned one time in the whole first half of this passage when all of this is going on. So this has us all kinds of confused as we journey on with Abram. Nevertheless, it's easy for us to read this story and just think, well, cheer up, Abe. Everything's going to be all right. Because we know how the story ends. And we know the type of God our God is. But listen, Abram doesn't. Not yet. They've only met. He's probably wondering, can I take this God at his word? Is this God going to come through? And the Israelites were probably wondering the same thing as Moses told them this story, because they're experiencing their own famine of sorts, wandering through the wilderness with no ready access to natural food or water. They too must be wondering, are the promises true? Are we going to make it? Or has he just brought us out here to die? I wonder if the same questions have ever plagued you. Do you find yourself in an impossible situation this morning, wondering where God is, asking if you can trust him to see you through? Listen, it's natural for our circumstances to test our faith. Indeed, they're testing Abram's faith, and so far so good. There's no indication that Abram has sinned at all at this point, and God has sovereignly gotten him and his family where they need to be in order to survive. But, as with most of us, the major test of our faith isn't just in our outward circumstances. It's what goes on in our hearts in response to our circumstances. And rather than trusting in God during his sojourn to Egypt, Abram begins to trust in himself. And we see this come out when Abram's faith is tested by his fears. Look at verse 11. It says, when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. See, apparently, Abram, like many men, outkicked his coverage when he met Sarai. Because Sarai is like a total knockout, apparently. Like straight up supermodel status here. And remember, Sarai's like 65 at this point, y'all. Like, okay, you might be thinking, good for her. Like, I hope when I'm 65, I still got it going on, right? Like, go ahead, Sarai. Be your easy, breezy, beautiful cover girl self, right? Like, high five, Abram. So what exactly is the problem here? Well, Abram says in verse 12, when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Now listen, it's totally natural for Abram to be afraid here. Indeed, Abram is entering into a dangerous situation. First of all, he and his family are entering into a foreign land as strangers, outsiders, immigrants, refugees, which means they are in a position of great vulnerability. By the way, this is why historically Jews and Christians have had a heart for strangers and aliens, for those who are immigrants and refugees, because that's who we once were in a spiritual sense. And it's who Israel once was in a literal sense, both when they lived as foreigners in Egypt and as they were scattered among the nations while in exile. And this started with the original father of Israel, Abram, whose spiritual pilgrimage began as a sojourner. So Abram is in a vulnerable situation because he is a stranger in a foreign land. But then adding to his vulnerability is the fact that he has something they're going to want. And this is the first time we see a character flaw in Abram. It certainly isn't going to be the last, because Abram is a sinner just like the rest of us. He didn't receive this calling because there was anything special about him. Remember, he was an idol-worshiping pagan until God showed up in his life. But notice here, Abram shows like zero concern for his wife. Like if anything, he seems to view her as a liability. Now, wait, Ricky, you might be thinking, she's not the one in danger. He's the one whose life is on the line. But listen, she was very much in danger. As a woman in this society, she was extremely vulnerable to abuse. So if he's concerned people are going to kill him for her, why is he not at least equally concerned for what they might do to her? But regardless, just as the land was integral to the promise, so too is this marriage, because this is the vehicle through which the promise would be fulfilled as God blesses them with a child. So if one of them dies, the promise dies with them. So maybe we can give Abram the benefit of the doubt and say this was his primary concern. But let's be real, there sure were a lot of me's and I's in his statements. Minimal concern for Sarai. But nevertheless, if it had stopped here, Abram still hasn't really done anything substantially wrong other than awkwardly thinking out loud to his wife about all his fears. Where Abram goes wrong is instead of trusting in the Lord to deliver them, he begins to rely on his own understanding. Maybe in order to keep this promise alive, he thinks, I need to take some drastic measures here because the promise is good, therefore the ends are good. So whatever means I have to take to get from the promise to the end, to keep that promise alive, to keep the ends achievable, well then those means must also be good. So he tells Sarai, verse 13, just tell him you're my sister, that it may go well with me because of you and that my life may be spared for your sake. Now, listen, I'm sure in Abram's mind, this wasn't that big of a deal. Technically, he's thinking, I'm not lying. Sarai was his half-sister. Again, ew, right? But in leaving out the critical detail that she is his wife, he is not only putting his wife in a vulnerable state by essentially pimping her out to interested Egyptian suitors, he's also causing men to unknowingly pursue an already married woman. So he is at the very least permitting the possibility of adultery, if not something worse. Now, Abram probably soothed his guilty conscience here by assuring himself that he would never let it get that far. Because in keeping with social norms of the day, as her brother, if anyone wanted to pursue her, they had to come to him. So he could indefinitely delay their betrothal by making really hard, impossible demands. Thus, he thought he could control this situation. You know, sin has a funny way of making us think that way, doesn't it? But do you see what has happened here? Abram has repeated the same sin as everyone else before him and everyone to come after him. He's taken a good gift from God and made it more important than God. And just like Adam and Eve did with the fruit, they took a good thing and they made it a God thing. And that's what Abram has done with the promise. He wants the promise God made so bad that he's forgotten about the God who made that promise. He's reverted to his pagan ways, willing to use any means possible to reach the promised end. Again, justifying it in his mind because he says the end is good. And you know, so many Christians today fall for the same lie. They convince themselves that doing this or supporting that or following this or making allies with that is justifiable because of what it achieves. But listen, good ends achieved through godless means are not pleasing to a good God. And Abram's about to learn that the hard way. Because God didn't just set Abram apart for a good end. He also set him apart to use godly means to get there. Nevertheless, Abram thought he was being so wise. Like, he's helping God out here, right? Outsmart the system. But that wisdom was about to backfire on him in a big way. Look at verse 14. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. So we see initially, everything's going according to plan. Abram was probably right proud of himself as he kept all of Sarai's suitors at bay. But then the unexpected happened. Look at verse 15. When the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Ruh-roh. See, unlike everyone else who would have to negotiate with Abram to get Sarai, Pharaoh could have any woman he wanted. Because Abram isn't his peer, he's not from another royal family, so there are no negotiations here. Pharaoh sees Sarai, Pharaoh likes Sarai, Pharaoh takes Sarai. So much for that plan, Abram. Cue Abram curled up in the corner crying to an out-of-tune version of "My Heart Will Go On" as he watches all his hopes and dreams sink like the Titanic. I mean, not to mix metaphors here, but there goes the balloon, right? See, Abram had been so concerned with his own survival, he seems to have forgotten that Sarai is just as important as he is to this calling. Just like in the beginning, we saw that Adam and Eve were not only both created in the image of God, but they were both essential to complete the mandate given by God to be fruitful and multiply and to rule and have dominion over the earth. In the same way here, Abram cannot become a great nation without Sarai by his side. But we got a big problem now. Sarai's out of the picture, and Abraham's continuing in a Celine playlist, belting out, "All by myself," right? Through his tears. And so once again, it seems like God's good design is in ruins. Just like with Adam and Eve in the garden, and later with Noah's naked post-deluge keg party. Once again, it's evident that there is none righteous, not one. No one who does good, no one who seeks for God. And I mean, God had every right to abandon Abram at this moment. Heck, to abandon all of mankind at this point. Because time after time, all we did was prove how unworthy we are for a relationship with him. But remember, God didn't choose Abram because Abram was righteous. He initiated a relationship with Abram in order to one day make him and us righteous. See, our relationship with God does not come through the good things that we do, because even the best of what we do is still tainted by sin. No, we're saved by grace through faith. And that started with Abram, who the Bible says believed in God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Listen, it doesn't say that he was righteous. It says he was counted righteous. And how could that be? Because while the wage of sin is death, because Abram believed in God's promise, God postponed the payment of death that Abram deserved for his sin. Because God wasn't only going to give Abram a son, through that son, he would eventually send his son. And that son would experience everything Abram and Israel experienced, including a refugee sojourn with his earthly parents to Egypt as they fled Herod's political violence. But it says, he also says of Abram that he's greater than Abram. Because he says, before Abraham was, I am. And unlike Abram, he never sinned. And because he never sinned, he was able to take the punishment that Abram and all of us deserved on the cross, taking the full weight of our sin. But not only that, he not only took on all our sin, on the cross, Jesus also transferred to us all his righteousness, so that all who believe, from Abram and Sarai to you and me, we can now be counted righteous in the eyes of God. Church, it is by grace we have been saved. And it is by grace that Abram has been saved so that we could be saved. So as bad as Abram has botched this, it was never dependent upon him in the first place. At least not ultimately. No, it was dependent upon God's work through him. See, God made the promise, and God never breaks his promise. Why? Because unlike Abram, there is no deception in him. He is truth with a capital T. So it is impossible for him to tell a lie. So even though Abram threw everything away with a lie, God is going to remain true. Because as Paul tells us in 2 Timothy 2:13, even when we are faithless, God remains faithful. Because he cannot deny himself, he said. Church, are you excited about that? Isn't that good news this morning? That no matter how bad you've blown it, listen, God won't disown it. He won't go back on his promise to you if you will turn from your sin and follow him. Listen, he's not going anywhere. He's not going to forsake you. There's nothing you can do to mess that up. So even with all of Abram's stupidity in this passage, God doesn't leave Abram. Not only that, get this, God is able to take even the evil that Abram did and somehow work it for good. Check this out. Because Sarai is in Pharaoh's harem, look at verse 16. It says, for her sake, Pharaoh dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep, he had oxen, he had male donkeys, he had male servants and female servants, female donkeys and camels. Do you see what's happening? Because Sarai is now a member of the royal household, the wealth of Egypt is bestowed upon Abram. Didn't God promise that he was going to make Abram great? Well, here he is pouring out blessing upon him, not because of Abram's works, but in spite of them. And God would do the same for the Israelites when he rescued them from Egypt. They would not only gain their freedom, it says they also left with all the Egyptian silver and gold. So God is making good on the promise both in Abram's day and Moses's, blessing Abram's family, making him great. But remember the other part of God's promise to Abram. He said, I will bless those who bless you, and what? Him who dishonors you, I will curse. And even though this whole situation is Abram's fault, Pharaoh's done some pretty serious dishonoring here, and God ain't about to let that dishonor go unchecked. Look at verse 17. It says, but the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. See, in the same way that God would later bring judgment on Egypt when he delivered his people through Moses, so too does he pour out plagues in the days of Abram, so that as a later Pharaoh would do, this Pharaoh too would let his people go. But notice God's primary concern here. It says he did this. Why? Because of Sarai. See, up until this point, no one is all that concerned with Sarai. Pharaoh just sees her as eye candy. Abram treats her like an inconvenience. No one seems to value her as a person. No one, that is, except God. See, he has not forgotten Sarai. He loves her just as much as Abram. And as we've seen, she's just as important as Abram to the calling. And we'll see later, she's also going to need just as much grace as Abram, because she too is going to nearly break up this marriage and mess up God's redemptive plan when she pimps out one of the Egyptian maids they probably acquired here to Abram in service to the promise. Yet another attempt at unholy means to try to achieve a good end. But notice, in good and bad, God is going to defend Abram and Sarai. Because by grace, through faith, they now belong to him. And my friend, no matter who you are, where you've been, what you've done, listen, he will do the same for you if you belong to him. Verse 18 says this, so Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that this was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. Listen, we don't know how Pharaoh came to know these things, but notice he's actually acting more righteously than Abram. So why is he under judgment and Abram is not? Because listen, again, salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone. You can be the most noble guy around, but if you have not called upon the name of the Lord, you will not be saved. He is outside the promise. Verse 20 says, and Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Notice how Moses is using similar language here as he did with Adam and Eve in the garden. Pharaoh asks, what is this you have done? Just like God asked the first man and woman when they sinned. In the same way, Pharaoh expels them from Egypt with guards, just as God expelled Adam and Eve from the garden with armed angels. But notice something significant has changed here. Whereas the first expulsion came with curse and destitution, This expulsion comes with a blessing and prosperity. Why? When both Adam and Eve and Abram and Sarai, they both sinned. Why did God do something different here? Here's why. Because of the promise God first gave to Adam and Eve that through their seed he would crush the evil serpents. And because of the promise he gave to Abram and Sarai that through their offspring all the nations of the earth would be blessed, God has begun his work of grace to restore his image in mankind and to bring us home to the place where his glory dwells, not by our works, but in spite of them, by grace through faith. So we see this is going to be God's work from beginning to end. Indeed, Pharaoh's command to go also echoes God's command to Abram at the beginning of this chapter. They don't belong here in Egypt, just as Abram's descendants won't. They belong in the land of the promise. And my friend, the same is true for you. Though you were born in a far country, separated from the goodness and blessing of God through his Son, God desires to bring you home, to deliver you to the land of the promise. And if today you will turn from your sin and you will trust in him, my friend, you can be saved. So what are you waiting for? Stop going back to the far country. Come home. Will you pray with me?